So I'd like to welcome you back to the second part of our program. So one of the important components of the Senator Malcolm Wallop Conversations on Democracy program and the fund named after the senator is to support these symposia that you're seeing here this afternoon, but also to support research. And it's been my privilege to work with the College of Arts and Sciences and the American Heritage Center in order to fund 3 students this year, 3 students who you're going to hear from this afternoon. To give you a little bit of background, Center for Global Studies funds international research for faculty because they're the ones who provide the opportunities that create these classes that take students overseas. And then we do a lot of funding for the students, and then we do this programming across the state of Wyoming, and we've been doing it for 8 years now. And let me just plug, Mark Jenkins is coming back on March 1st out at the Whitney Concert Hall. So, yeah, so I hope if you've never gone, if you want to see a Wyoming native who's crazy enough to climb every mountain in the world, this time he's talking about tea, tyranny, and trade, looking at his experiences in Tibet and China over the last 20 years. So we're moving back into geopolitics for the talk this time, but there'll be some great pictures. But this afternoon, I shouldn't say this because these aren't many Mark Jenkinses, but if you think about it, it's about getting people into the field, whether it's into the farm field or just getting some experience. And I'm really pleased to introduce our students this afternoon. We will do 3 presentations focusing on their international research funded by the Wallop Fund, and then we'll do the Q&A as a panel following that. So these 3 students were funded on a variety of topics looking at democracy. I think Gary did a really nice job pointing out the importance of institutions, concepts like identity, and so we're going to be moving around the world in our presentations. We will start with Eric Nye, who is from Cheyenne. Eric spent 12 years in Iraq working for USAID and actually running USAID projects in Iraq. Came back to do a master's in international studies at the University of Wyoming. He will be followed by David Demick, who actually is a graduate of Sheridan High School, and he came over as an exchange student from Frankfurt, went on to Sheridan College, came down to the University of Wyoming. I love that path. And is now in his 3rd year in the law school. And Chris Hare focused on research at the British, I always say the British Museum, which is incorrect, the British Archives, looking at British national identity and understandings of democracy. Let me say that David Demick spent an internship last summer at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So we're just going to do these presentations in succession. So I'd like to invite up Eric Nye.
Gotta get my notes. It's great to be here with everyone today. As Jean mentioned, my name is Eric Nye, and I'm big on figuring out how these things work. Yes, okay. So, as she mentioned, I'm from Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I'm going to talk about, I'm a 2nd-year master's degree student in international studies, global area studies program. I'm going to talk about Iraq and how U.S. development policy has been run in Iraq up to now. So a little bit of background about myself. Jean already said some things, but just to sort of expand on that, I first went over to the Middle East in '99 as part of I graduated Central High School in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Go Indians. Anyway, so I don't know the mascot for Sheridan. So I went to find myself in the Middle East, in Jordan, Sudan. We did a camel trek across the Sudanese desert for a while. Eventually, when things opened up in Iraq, I entered into Iraq. I called my dad up, who had some money, and I was penniless. I said, "Can I borrow a few bucks?" And so he wired me some money. We bought 2 cars. This was in May of 2003. We went to the Zarqa Free Market in Jordan and bought 2 cars, me and my buddy, and we just took off into the sunset, across the Iraqi border, through Fallujah, up through Samarra, into Mosul, and then west to Sinjar, where the genocide happened recently. You might recall. And actually, my best friends who I went with at the time were Yazidis, who were grossly affected by that by ISIS's occupation of that area. So I lived in Iraq, in Baghdad for 12 years, married an Iraqi woman named Tanya, beautiful, made me a better man. We had 3 kids, 3 girls who all attended school in Baghdad. I was living in the community. I speak Arabic very fluently. So I'd get up in the morning, make my coffee, get in the car, turn on the radio, put my kids in the car seats, drive them to school, drop them off, say hi to the guards at the checkpoints, and then go to work. And then I'd come back. And I was running, as Gene mentioned, USAID programs. So I know some things about Iraq, and I was puzzled and wanted to figure out why we haven't done a better job. And if you recall, and Ambassador Grappo did mention some of this, why we went into Iraq in the first place, largely related to events of the times, having things to do with terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Our answer was democracy. We wanted to take democracy to Iraq. As Ambassador Grappo also mentioned, it wasn't our initial plan to be so invested in the democratization of Iraq, but we ended up doing that and sort of stuck with it. Unfortunately, the way things turned out, as you see on the screen, wasn't so good. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, lots of American soldiers lost. Democracy turned into something that our founding fathers feared, something called the tyranny of the majority. We learned this yesterday in the We the People session at the Sheridan High School, which essentially is one sect or group takes advantage of their being the majority to oppress the minority in the country. And as a result, we had the disenfranchisement of Sunni Arabs in Iraq and the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate as a part of the Islamic State. So it's safe to say that our original goal of going in to supposedly fight terrorism, what we actually did was we spawned terrorism, okay? So many people have offered up explanations as to why we didn't succeed in Iraq. Lots of different ideas as to why, and none of those ideas really have produced a dramatic change in our policy. So what I decided to do is do what I know best and go to the people of Iraq. This is me in the Euphrates River with my buddy near Babylon, the ruins of ancient ruin of Babylon, and talk to the Iraqi people about what they think we did wrong in Iraq and give them a voice. So I went to various places in the country. I started in Baghdad, and by the way, I was sanctioned by the University of Wyoming to do this and funded by the Wallop Fund and the University of Wyoming to do this, which was a risk for the university to do, but taking into account the background and the value of this research, they did that, and that's a great thing to the university's credit. So I started here in Baghdad, where I'm based out of, where we still have a rented home, my family and I. I spent some time in Karbala, which is a Shia area, and as you can see on the map, the yellow areas are predominantly Shia, the green area is predominantly Sunni, and then you have, the red area is predominantly Sunni, and the green areas up north, predominantly Kurdish. And so I spent some time here down in the south. This is near Fallujah, and the Fallujah, retaking of Fallujah was going on while I was there. So all the refugees coming out of that were amassing here. I spent some time on the ISIS front up here in this Sunni area in a place called Daybaka, and then in Kurdistan in a couple places. And so I got some different views of different people that had different things to say. And I just want to note that I talked to Sunnis, Shias, and of course you know that, as Gary pointed out, Ambassador Grappo, that there's a sort of a Sunni-Shia sectarian struggle going on. And so this gentleman here represents a very notorious sort of Iranian-funded Shia militia, and I spoke to his main spokesperson. And then this gentleman here was responsible, in big part, one of the responsible actors for the Sunni Awakening back in 2007. So lots of different interesting people, different places, and so forth. So what do Iraqis think? Iraqis think that, number one, they all had to say, and I talked to about 70 people, by the way, of the different walks of life again, and they had things to say like, at first, everyone would express their gratitude, that they were grateful that the United States had saved them from the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. But then they had a lot of things to say about what they thought we should be doing better, or we could have done better, which I asked them for, and they gave to me very willingly and in volumes. And so all of that sort of adds up to, though, that they think that we have abandoned them. and they don't understand exactly why we did what we did and left things the way we did. So this is kind of reflected in some of the things that these are some statistics of some studies that were actually done that I actually found more Iraqis, greater percentage of Iraqis that I interviewed also had to say the same things, though. They think that the United States actually supports ISIS. I had a lot of Iraqis tell me stories about how they've either seen with their eyes when they were fighting on the fronts or heard from very close relatives who were fighting on the fronts that the U.S. would airdrop supplies to ISIS. And I just couldn't understand how in the world they thought that, but they did. 40% think that we actively sought to destabilize things in Iraq. You have here an example of an official institution that we spent lots of money training, that police in Basra who are marching over American and Israeli flags in protest and disgust of what they think that the United States has done to their country. So what did we do wrong? I mean, it's not that from our perspective, we actually set out to make things worse in Iraq. So here's some things that they had to say. So they said that, number one, our development agenda focused on the wrong things. As Ambassador Grappo said, Iraq lacked the institutions to support democracy. So we went to work right away establishing those institutions. Unfortunately, a lot of, after, hindsight's 20/20, a lot of studies have been done, and a lot of people have now sort of put some insight into this, and it's not necessarily establishing the institution. It's not necessarily the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. You have to make sure that they play baseball to begin with. You see what I'm saying? So the Iraqi people have had their lives organized in such a way and have certain values, some of values which we share, like the importance of family, the importance of tradition. But there's some other interesting things, particular to their culture, and particular the years and decades of dictatorship that they've come out of living in, that will not support their easy transition into democracy. And so some things need to be done a little bit differently. Sectarianism. We were not prepared for the Sunni-Shia sectarian divide. And in fact, when we disbanded the army, we unwittingly supported sectarianism because of the large majority of Sunni leaders that were pushed out, and then when the new army was recreated, the Sunnis they boycotted the new army, and so most of the new security apparatus became Shia. And there's another thing too, and you can tell sort of by the story where I'm going on this, is that, and this is something I think that's a nuance that we miss, and unfortunately, because of the way the U.S. State Department and our political system is designed to go after any time a U.S. diplomat or someone who represents the United States is harmed, we actually build walls. We start building walls, and we isolate ourselves from the populations of these countries, particularly where it's most critical in post-conflict countries, where we're trying to actively gain the narrative. And what I mean by that is tell the story of why we are there. We all know in this room, and some of you probably sacrificed blood and tears and money through our taxes to go and help this country get established, not just out of altruism, but because we believe it's also in our national security to have a stable world and a stable Middle East. So some of these institutions that Ambassador Grappo mentioned. So instead of engaging with people, what we do is we withdraw. And if you say, and there was one time when the Consul General of Basra engaged with some people in Basra that went viral on social media because people want to know that America is there to stand with them. The response of the U.S. diplomatic representatives in Baghdad I spoke to at the time said, that was risky, and I don't think we'll do that again. But they made incredible ground by reaching out to people in the face of opposing stories about why we were there. So unfortunately, when we don't step up and engage with people and we don't provide counter narratives, we don't come out on the news and say, no, we're actually not dropping supplies to ISIS. We're on your side. And we're here, and it's in Arabic. It's not to the U.S. media. It's in Arabic, and it's something they can understand, and it's in ways that they can understand. I go and stand with those soldiers who are fallen in those hospitals, and I visit them as a representative of the U.S. government. and they see that I am really standing with them, they'll of course be able to say, no, that's hogwash. They're not dropping those supplies. And even if I thought I saw it, it's not really what it's happening. Instead, they're filling in the blanks, or Iran, through their funding of these militias, is telling our story. Iran is telling our story by us neglecting to tell the story. So what can be done about this? Possibly, I heard Ambassador Grappa talking about this during the break a little bit. Possibly pull the fighting factions apart. Exercise federalism, which was part of the original design of the Iraqi Constitution. If we just go back to sort of our end game here, like what do we want to accomplish in Iraq? We want to see, right now, we want to see an end to terrorism. We want to return to stability. And I think that we have to ask ourselves as the United States government, and this needs to come from the people too, what's the best way to do that? Is the best way to do that by isolating ourselves and allow others to control the narrative, by misappropriating our hard-spent tax-earned dollars, or is it simply just engaging with the people? Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Malcolm Wallop Fund for the Conversations on Democracy and the various other people that funded me, and welcome my colleague David Dimick to come up and give his presentation.
Before I begin, I would like to say that the Bronx are the best team in the state. That being said, we're just going to wait until the next slide is ready for us to go. Perfect. A little bit about myself. As I was introduced, my name is David Demick. I am originally from Frankfurt, Germany, still a German citizen. However, I've lived in Wyoming for the last 11 and a half years. I first came here in about 2005, where I was part of the Sheridan High School. Had the pleasure to go to the National History Day competition, so it was quite wonderful to meet with the We the People students as well as the Model United Nations students. And one little difference for me as compared to my colleagues is I didn't have a research question when I went to the International Criminal Court last summer. Rather, I started out with a personal question. What is international justice? How do we relate between countries, and how do we make peace when there's so much tendency towards war? So that's why the title officially is the balancing between the respect for sovereignty with the mandate against impunity. So a little bit about myself so you understand who you're dealing with. As I mentioned, I am originally from Germany. This is the German carnival, very, very cold during the February months. This is my mother on the left here with the wonderful 70s glasses. She emigrated from Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, specifically Serbia, into Germany while it was still split in two. I was born in '88, so I was actually born in West Germany. Now, I was only a year old when the wall fell, but I do remember quite a few things happening during that time. The wall came down. For me, Germany was always unified. The reason that I'm showing you this slide, however, specifically is that my mother, being from Serbia originally, 1999 was glued to the German TV, watching German tornado bombers as well as American bombers hit infrastructure targets within Serbia. And being 11 years old, that was the first time that I really thought about, why is one country that I call my home, Germany, bombing the other country that I also call my home, my cultural home? Much like many of you say, oh yeah, I'm 1/8 German. I've had that conversation many times as well. And that was an interesting dynamic that my 11-year-old brain was not really able to work out. However, it led me down this path where I ended up in Sheridan, ultimately in Laramie. Then Dr. Garrison and I actually also went to the Model United Nations in New York. So this was actually in the United Nations building in New York itself. And that was an amazing opportunity. And ultimately, it led me last summer to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where I not only had the pleasure to work with a former alumna from the University College of Law, where I'm completing my degree now, my JD degree. For those of you that know her, Ida Dijkstal. But I also had the pleasure to work with what is called a mock trial, and this is actually within the chambers of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or short ICTY. We'll just call it the Yugoslavia Court. That being said, I want to give you all a little bit of a background. So that was my personal question. How do we make peace in the world? And ultimately, you will see that it comes down to sovereignty, respecting sovereignty, versus bringing impunity, bringing someone to justice, war criminal specifically. So without really making this into how to make a war criminal, right? How to make a murder, little allegory there for those of you that watch Netflix. A little bit about the International Criminal Court. This is a picture of the criminal court. Thanks to the Malcolm Wallop Fund as well as a few other sources of funding, I was able to live about 45 seconds from the court, which was amazing. This is the view as you walk toward it. A little bit on the history of the court. After World War II, we had two major international criminal tribunals, specifically the military tribunals for the Tokyo trials as well as the Nuremberg trials. For those of you that are familiar with this, you might already know this, but there was no international criminal law at the time. So the perpetrators of some of the worst crimes against humanity ever committed had no law under which they could be prosecuted. So especially American litigators did a phenomenal job laying a foundation and a legacy for prosecuting future war criminals, ultimately leading to the ICTY, the Yugoslav courts, as well as the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. After that, and toward the end of the 90s, countries had been considering the idea, instead of having very limited courts for specific incidents, which can cost a lot of money to run, but is very limited. Let's make a permanent court. Let's make a court that can hear those cases on a rolling basis, if you want to call it that. And that brought about the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute specifically gives the International Criminal Court three purposes. And think of the Rome Statute as the constitution of the ICC. It is supposed to build a permanent institution that can handle the most serious crimes of international law and be complementary to domestic law. Now, complementarity is really what I would like to focus on here today, because that is that balancing act between having respect for the sovereignty of a state to prosecute the criminals of its own versus the international court coming in and making sure that those criminals are not being allowed to exist in impunity. Right? So the official definition up there is the domestic jurisdictions enjoy primacy. Primacy, again, meaning that domestic jurisdictions, if they're capable to hear a case, should hear the case first before the ICC can step in. Now, again, as with many things, and for those of you that had to suffer through a legal education, there are many caveats and exceptions to all the rules. You know that if there's inadequate or ineffective prosecution, trials, the ICC can step in, and this is found in the Article 17 of the ICC statute, which really brings me to why we're here today. So we have this tension. We want to respect the state's sovereignty because we don't want to undermine their judiciary. We don't want to undermine their view in the world, and especially for the people that live within the country, that they are not capable of prosecuting the crimes in their country. However, oftentimes in a war-torn country like Iraq, the judicial infrastructure simply doesn't exist to be able to do that, or at least that's our perception. So we have to balance that. To explain a little bit of the comics that are up there, one of the main criticism against the ICC is that it has only really prosecuted members of the African countries. Furthermore, this has often been seen as an undermining factors for those African countries, that they cannot properly run their own governments without the ICC, and specifically us, the West, the northern countries, as they're most often in the international community referred to, are kind of dominating in their judicial respect. So what did I do? I worked on two major cases before the ICC. One of those cases, I actually worked on a defense team. And you see here Abdullah al-Sanusi. I will speak about Mr. Sanusi a little bit more in a second, but for those of you that know him, know that he has been alleged of being a war criminal. And the first thought that would go through my head if I were you is, why would this nice little German boy try to represent this war criminal before the court, correct? And I would like to bring up a conversation that I had with a Pakistani international student while I was weed whacking up at Sheridan College many years ago. He asked me why I wanted to go to law school, and I explained to him, because it's justice and balance and having a prosecutor and defendant. And he asked me, if you have someone that you know is a rapist, why would you defend him? You know it. You can just find him guilty. You put him in jail or do whatever. And that was a question that always stuck with me. And my answer that I found working at the International Criminal Court, defending someone like Mr. al-Sanusi, is that we need to make sure that the justice process is defensible, because that ultimately is what builds democracy. Without a proper justice process, we have what is called a kangaroo court, where the powerful, like the Star Chambers in the UK, were able to simply prosecute anyone that they want to with impunity themselves. We have to ensure, as the populace, as the citizenship, as the attorneys, that the justice system can function properly. So, going back to Mr. al-Sanusi, You will see in this picture Mr. Muammar Gaddafi on your perspective to the right, and Mr. al-Sanusi on the left. Muammar Gaddafi was the controlling authoritarian, let's call him dictator, of Libya for 40-some years after a military putsch. Mr. al-Sanusi was the head of intelligence, of military intelligence for Libya, or more commonly referred to, spy chief. Now, Mr. Muammar Gaddafi was becoming increasingly concerned as the ambassador has referred to the Arab Spring spreading over from Tunisia into Egypt. So he ordered Mr. al-Sanusi to do whatever was necessary in order to suppress this movement. This brings us to the reason why this ended up being before the International Criminal Court. You see here a picture of Fatih Terbil. Mr. Terbil was or continues to be the civil rights lawyer for the victims of those murdered or allegedly murdered at the Abu Salim prison massacre of 1996. A little bit of more background. Mr. al-Sanusi is alleged to have ordered the killing of roughly 2,000 prison inmates who were rebelling against the conditions within a prison in Libya. He was representing the victims. He brought the case. He was trying to bring the case to Libyan courts, was arrested, was put into prison for that, and roughly 500 individuals were protesting against his imprisonment. That protest was violently put down. Hundreds died. Even more were injured. This brought the International Criminal Court to bring 3 warrants against Muammar Gaddafi, his son al-Islam Gaddafi, as well as my client, ultimately, Mr. al-Sanusi. Now, after the warrant was issued, Mr. al-Sanusi as well as Mr. Gaddafi were able to circumvent being caught by Libyan officials as well as other officials in the northern African continent. However, ultimately, about a year later, Mr. al-Sanusi was caught in Mauritania. He was trying to leave Nouakchott airport. Now, Mauritania, also a Muslim country, was unwilling to extradite Mr. al-Sanusi to any country that was not Muslim. There were requests by France to have him extradited there because Mr. al-Sanusi has also been alleged to have ordered terror bombings against flights. He was requested, of course, by the ICC to be extradited there, extradition meaning sent to that country. And then ultimately Libya also sent a request for extradition because it wanted to try Mr. al-Sanusi under its domestic laws. Mauritania complied with the request by Libya because it is also a Muslim country. So it trusted that its justice process would be served and not a northern or, from our perspective, Western country perspective. Which brings us to the actual detention and some of the issues that arose. And that's why I mentioned this story of me representing Mr. al-Sanusi. If we want to ensure that the judgment that we bring against someone is just and defendable, we have to ensure that the process to get to that judgment has to be proper. Here we see a picture of Mr. Gaddafi's son, al-Islam Gaddafi, being beat and essentially prodded into giving a confession. There are multiple such issues as the council that I worked for, myself, anybody else, was never allowed to actually speak with Mr. al-Sanusi. The same was true for al-Islam Gaddafi as well. They were not given any opportunity to bring counter evidence against their claims. They never saw a local attorney for their representation. And there's also evidence of coerced confessions on their part. Ultimately, there was a trial held against all of them. And all of them were sentenced to death. This is what we call in the legal community a kangaroo court. Now, it has nothing to do with Australia, and I know Australia has been kind of on the news here lately for the last couple days. But the point of a kangaroo court, as I said before, is that it holds whoever it wants responsible for whatever it thinks is the just cause. And it will do so without giving that other side an opportunity to fight against that claim. Now, I would like to also point out the International Criminal Court follows the continental system. So where I'm from, Europe, it's much more, there's one judge, and that judge has quite a bit of leeway. Doesn't really have to follow precedent, just has to follow statutory law. In America, we believe, and yes, I include myself in that, not being an American citizen, but having very much learned the American system, we believe in an adversarial system, where the truth is determined by having one side present its version of the truth, the other side presenting that version of the truth, and then having the fact finder, in this case a jury, for example, determine what the actual truth is. Now we have a case where only the prosecution was able to bring evidence. Mr. al-Sanusi was just sitting behind, essentially in a cage with the other dozen or so accused and was sentenced to death. That brings me to that ultimate question. Libya is a country that is trying to recover from the aftershocks of the Arab Spring, something that, as the ambassador has pointed out, we hope was going to make Libya a stronger democracy. And yet it's sectarianism that is tearing Libya still apart on a low-key way, if you want to think about it that way. But ultimately, it is still not necessarily a government that can hold these kind of hearings without having some kind of interest slip into the judicial process. Therefore, while the ICC ultimately stepped down and recognized the domestic decision, it is, again, the council that I work for, in my opinion, that it was not the right decision to do so, because ultimately, Mr. al-Islam Gaddafi was let off the hook. He has been granted amnesty, the death sentence has obviously been commuted, and he can now travel freely within the country. That means that Mr. al-Islam Gaddafi had some kind of information or some kind of key players in the background that were able to excommunicate his sentence, where Mr. al-Gaddafi or Mr. al-Sanusi did not. So that is another example of why this was ultimately a kangaroo court. The biggest concern from my international law perspective, the law that I hope to practice one day, is that not only does it undermine the Libyan government, but it also undermines our mission to bring justice to those perpetrators of war crimes, that it brings impunity to the world, that a court simply has to claim complementarity, as I pointed out, the third prong, and undermine the justice process internationally. With that, there's not much more to say. The problem is Libya has control over that. Libya had control over that, and the ICC does not necessarily have the power relations to enforce its judgment or enforce the warrant being brought. It relies on the sovereignty of nations to cooperate with it. And ultimately, what we have to look to is soft power mechanisms, trying to work with the individuals within the country, as Eric has pointed out, trying to build those kind of relations, as the ambassador has talked about, in order to effect justice in the world. And of course, I would have not been able to say any of this today to you or try to make any kind of jokes about the Bronx being better than whatever is in Cheyenne. You know, I obviously don't know what they are. Without the Malcolm Wallop Fund, as well as the Dick and Lynn Cheney Fund, and also the UW Center for International Human Rights. Thank you very much. Oh. And let me please introduce Chris Hare as our final speaker for the night.
Hi, hang on. Hi, my name is Chris Hare, and I'm an MA candidate in history at the University of Wyoming. And I'm here to talk about my research, which deals with the formation of British nationalism during the era of Napoleon. So unlike the rest of the panelists and speakers here today, all of the people I will be talking about have been long dead. So my research deals with the 25 years from roughly 1790 to 1815. And I don't know how much time sort of non-historians spend thinking about this time, so I'm going to give you a brief primer of what's going on. Oh dear. Okay. So British and French people have had long antagonisms with each other, as anyone who's studied history should know. But I'm going to briefly go over this. So Britain is largely Protestant and specifically Anglican at this time, and France is still largely Catholic, 95% Catholic. But it's often perceived as atheist after the French Revolution, which has just happened. And I'm not going to go too much into this, but here it is. I'm going to take you, so I work specifically with the print materials that proliferated in the early 19th century, and the print materials that industrialization made available for the first time to the vast majority of the populace. These included caricatures like this one. So you have Nelson sitting on the left and Napoleon on the right, and these were produced for an elite audience by members of the elite. So James Gilray, who produced this print, lived on St. James, which is the street the prince now lives on, and you can find an apartment there for a couple £1 million. But these within them both push the idea of British nationalism that comes about during this time and also have subtle critiques of that. So you'll notice that Napoleon is sort of carving off Europe and Nelson is carving off the American chunk of the world. which is a subtle jab after the recent loss of the American colonies. Here we go. The other print materials that were available to the lower classes were broadsides, like this one. And these were much less subtle in their messaging. So this one was produced by a Baptist minister, Louis Mayer, and it literally conflated Napoleon with the beast from Revelations. And you'll see that he invented a very sophisticated math system to sort of make Napoleon's name add up to 666 here. So the research questions I went to Britain with were, how were these people motivated to participate in war after they had so recently just gotten out of the colonial wars? And these were very expensive conflicts with Napoleon. How do you motivate a populace that's already weary to sort of participate in war again? And what is the role of print images and class within these messages? This is the British Library where I went. The British Library does have a relationship with the British Museum and contains most of the manuscripts from Britain's history. I literally held in my hand documents from 1795, and I still can't believe they let me do that. So I'm going to take you through 4 of these images and sort of just explain to you what's going on in them, and hopefully that will be interesting to you. So this is a print by Rowlandson, The Contrast, and it's contrasting British ideas of liberty with the perceived French ideas of liberty. And so you'll notice, for Britain, it's all the class is inherently coded into this because they sort of talk about inheritance and property. And Britannia is here, the Navy, always a point of pride for the British. And the French, there's a person hanging here, and this is Lady Liberty, by the way, and she's literally treading on a corpse. You'll see that proposed French values are here: treachery, famine, and ultimately misery, right? This is Gilray's interpretation of basically the same argument, but this is French liberty versus British slavery. So you'll remember at this time, George III is still in charge. The Hanovers were notoriously unpopular kings, even in Britain. The colonists here, of course, always talked about taxation without representation. The average British citizen also did not have representation in Parliament and paid those same taxes. And it was often very unpopular. So French liberty entails starving, right? And British slavery, you'll notice this man is very well fed, right? And the message is clear here to the lower class. You may feel as if you are taken advantage of, but being in Britain, it is inherently better. You are at least fed. I will point out that during industrialization, poverty was very widespread in Britain, and there were people that did sort of live with starvation daily. And so this argument would have had a profound effect on them because it was a genuine fear. If you trust the elite government, you won't starve. There were a couple of, this is by Gilray as well, there were a couple of years when the invasion panic was particularly high, and 20/20 vision is, of course, always perfect in hindsight. But for them, an invasion from Napoleon seemed imminent. And this articulates the fear that they had. There's literally blood running in the streets. The free green cap is here. And there was a genuine worry that London would be ransacked. Some of the broadsides that were circulated detailed the cruelties of French soldiers in places like Italy and Germany. And British citizens were very concerned. However, British people did respond to the call, and many of them volunteered for the Volunteer Corps, even though they had to pay for their uniforms out of their pocket, even if they were very poor. So their ambitions and hopes and confidence, I suppose, is articulated by this next print by Gilray as well. The title of this print is Bonaparte 48 Hours After Landing, okay? And this figure here is John Bull, and he's seen as the British everyman. The argument is literally that 48 hours after landing, our good old boys would take care of him, right? And you'll also notice that there is a subtle message about class here as well. John Bull is a very fat man here, right? Very well fed. Okay. So I just want to talk about the reason that this research might be relevant now is that the proliferation of printed materials did create nationalism in Britain in a way that it had not been before. We tend to think about Britain as a united country of English-speaking white people, and now that is true, but you have to remember that the Act of Union in 1707 combined a group of people that were largely not religious congruent and spoke many languages, and this period of time did manage for them to form a British identity in reaction that sort of valued stability and elite culture over the sort of populist revolution. And I think it might be interesting for us to sort of think about the way, what is our American identity constructed on, and what is it constructed in opposition to? And how does the information that we consume sort of influence the way that we perceive ourselves and others, right? So I would like to thank the Senator Malcolm Wallop Fund, as well as my other sources of funding, for sending me to the British Library, and thank you very much. Bye.
So we're going to have the mic go around, and any questions you have for the work that students were involved in.
Any questions?
This in regard to the your discussion about Iraq, and I wondered about the crimes to humanity versus genocide versus our approach to Assad and Syria, because the country has, the executive department saw Syria as not able to accept Assad in any way. Assad indicated with all his aggression that these were rebels. And how does a legal person look to that?
Okay, to begin with, I was, David might actually be able to answer this better than I, as far as the legal ramifications of what you do to declare a genocide or not. So the question, what is the question exactly? How do you determine whether it's a genocide or not?
Yes, essentially, how does another nation act in creating this opinion about another independent nation, and have this become an international incident like Milosevic in the Serbian area?
I think I don't necessarily have the perfect answer for you, but I can give you some of the outlines for it. And I think it ultimately boils down to international politics and power relations, because there are many atrocities that could be committed by a multitude of dictators and maybe not quite as authoritarian figures around the world, but they are not necessarily defined as a genocide or a war crime because there is no international will to do so. And one thing that we really have to keep in mind is who backs and who protects the Assad regime in Syria specifically, because if we look at the big powers in play here, we don't just have the United States, which has been trying to stay out of it as much as possible because of the lessons learned in Iraq and Afghanistan and the incredible cost, not just in monetary value, but also human lives that has gone into those two states, but because of the backing of Russia. And one of the things that I didn't really go into too much detail, because we did have Dr. Garrison tell us that we should be rather concise and leave some of this up for the questions, is because the court, the International Criminal Court, for example, can hear cases through three main ways. But one of those ways is submission by the UN Security Council. The Security Council you can think of as the executive branch of the United Nations. The Security Council has one part that is alternating every year, but it has 5 major seats that are always on it and have veto powers. So We could draft, as the United States, we could draft a resolution that calls for a warrant for why am I blanking on the name of Assad? Yeah, for Assad, just like they did for Muammar Gaddafi, as I showed, but that will likely be vetoed by Russia. So there's not the lack of a will to declare the actions and the evidence that Human Rights Watch has, for example, brought forward that Mr. Assad has used chemical weaponry against his own citizens, which can fall within the war crimes and crimes against humanity prongs and crimes of the ICC. But ultimately, what we're lacking is the political will to go through with it until such a time that the Assad regime, for example, is decidedly defeated, and therefore Russia doesn't have the necessary claim anymore or the interest in the Assad regime, or vice versa. It might never come to pass if Assad is able to regain control of the country, regain control of the region as a whole, and, for example, sets himself out as an opponent, a strong opponent to ISIS. At that point, we must also consider the international implication of do we have someone in Syria that is willing to fight against ISIS? And that's what I'm saying. There's a lot of in there, and this is what's happening. That's what I'm saying. So I'm running on. I'm rambling. I hope that answered your question. So,
Another question?
My question is for Chris, specifically. I was wondering if you could talk about how the British national identity is holding up these days with the rise of the Scottish National Party, with the recent referendum on leaving the United Kingdom, and with the strong preference of Scotland to remain in the European Union post-Brexit.
Sure. So I was actually in London about 3 weeks after the Brexit vote. And so when you find yourself in a pub, you often get to talking about Brexit. So I mostly talk to Londoners because that's where I was. It's going to be an interesting transition. I know that most of the people my age have not been thrilled and are nervous about the possibility of not being able to freely move and work, right? And anybody who has any claim to an Irish passport, I believe, is trying to get one. I don't really want to speculate too much, but I would guess that Scotland is probably going to try to leave. I don't know if that referendum will be true. The UK is going to be an interesting place, and I'm not sure how this is going to change. Theresa May is sort of talking about the strongest leave possible. So I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I was there when Theresa May took office, and it's been very mixed. I don't know, to be honest.
More questions? Candy.
Thank you all. I also have a question for Chris, and I'm not sure if this was in the scope of your research, but the publications, the newspapers, printing the more sophisticated, I guess, cartoon images, were those in the papers because of editorial board that we might understand? Was that editorial board working with the government at all? Was the press fairly independent? Or?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I should be a bit more clear. Caricatures were a almost entirely private enterprise. They sometimes interfered with government policy. For example, Gilray was on the government payroll 2 times. But we don't really know the nature of that relationship. I will also say they were not in newspapers per se. Newspapers really don't start to circulate in Britain until the late 19th century, partially because of the Stamp Act and other things like that. So broadsides were pasted up or read in bars, and caricatures were collector's items. They were art pieces, and they would have somewhat of a limited run. Gilray, for example, would make up a plate. There would be about 250 of those run. He would hand ink them and sign them. But they were circulated through elite culture, and also there was a series of them that were produced pro bono publico by people like Dalrymple. And he basically said to Gilray, all right, I want a series of these produced at cost, and if there's any profit we'll pay it to you, and if it's a loss, then I'll take it. But I want to post these up in the ale houses so that the people can see them. So it's definitely a conspicuous pressure downward, but it's not necessarily to do with any sort of conception of a free press that we would think about, I guess is what I would say.
This is a question for Eric, and it may be one without an answer, but can you speculate for us about the future in Iraq? Is sectarianism resolvable or just an irresolvable issue? Thank you.
Sure. So let me start by really quickly talking about what happened in 2007 with the surge. You're all familiar with something called the surge. We sent more troops over in 2007. What accompanied the surge was a strategy designed by Petraeus and the U.S. military to basically welcome those Sunni Muslims back into the fold who were previously standing with Al-Qaeda. So without judging them, without bringing them to trial, depending on the tribal chiefs to make that happen, and we sort of, if you compare it to the amount of money we spend on our own troops, provided a very minuscule, small sum of money to help them to be able to do that. They basically hired them to stand guard over neighborhoods, for example. And so that's how we handled that situation, and we exploited sort of like cultural issues and things that were happening to be able to do that. So fast forward now to what's going on in Mosul. So once again, Sunnis have felt disenfranchised, just like they were pre-2007. The problem you have now in Mosul is that a lot of these families that are living in Mosul, for example, Sunni families that stayed or forced to stay or wanted to just not leave their homes or otherwise, a family member was conscripted to fight alongside of ISIS against the Iraqi military, right? ISIS committed atrocities against Shia soldiers that were part of the Iraqi military. So let's say that we win the Battle of Mosul, kick ISIS out. What about all those people that are left in Mosul, right? So who's going to come in now and serve justice to the people of Mosul, these soldiers that were fighting against? So all these families now are going to be thinking, okay, the government's coming for my kid next. And so no one in the city of Mosul is going to be accepting of business as usual, central Iraqi government, predominantly, again, the tyranny of the majority, coming in to rule that minority majority city. So that what I put up on the screen, I did in one of my negotiations class, we did an analysis where we sort of ran some numbers and looked at options. And the most viable option, it was sort of an optimization thing we did. The most viable option for post-ISIS Mosul is to look at federalism, to actually give the Sunnis the ability to determine for themselves who they're going to hold accountable and how they're going to hold those people accountable, not the Shia governments backed by the Iranian-funded militias. That will not work. So you'll either be looking at Turkey sticking their nose in there. They're ready to put their flag down. You got the Kurds looking to carve up pieces of what's left of Mosul. But ultimately, it will have to be an entity. If you want stability, it'll have to be an entity other than the Shia-led Baghdad government that'll have to step in. And then if we can draw those lines and create some kind of federal regions, we will be able to see stability, I think, if we were able to do that.
Eric, again, thank you. You did a great job of explaining what went wrong in Iraq and how we need to get our narrative out there. But is it going to happen? Surely there are people in the State Department who must see that we're not communicating to the local people what we've done right. And do you see a way to convince our own government to try to tell our stories that should be told and try to put us in a better light in that region?
Unfortunately, I think this is. Let's just all recall how Benghazi was turned into something that could be politicized and used against to slam Hillary Clinton over the head, right? Obviously, Chris Stevens, right? Chris Stevens, the ambassador, who was a dear colleague of Gary's, made a decision on his own and for which he had the ability to make and was given the authority to make, as Ambassador Grappo has explained to me, the ambassador has the final say in the country. He's the one that, he or she is the one that understands what's going on the ground. They make the decision. Ambassador Chris Stevens was a believer in the ability to influence narrative. And so he went out there and guess what? Bad luck, he was killed. I think our U.S. soldiers who constantly represent the United States overseas and get into very dangerous missions, also unfortunately, and do so willingly to stand up for the right for this nation and our national security, do so willingly. And sometimes there's a sacrifice to be paid, as some have felt more than others. I think members of the diplomatic corps would like to engage, and Ambassador Grappo, can I correct me if I'm wrong, but would like to engage more with the populations that they're in. But our political climate being such as it is, where we're ready to crucify our leaders because we allow or permit our diplomatic corps to actively engage, knowing that there's risks in these countries, I don't think we'll see that. I think instead we'll see our missions in hard spots continue to withdraw, to build higher walls, and to remove ourselves from engaging with people. That's not to say that programs like Ambassador Grappo talked about, like MEPI, and things that USAID are doing will not continue, and those are very effective. However, I think that there's some interesting things that could be done to try to mitigate the risk of possible mishaps when people are caught in crossfire in the crosshairs. And we have to actually actively seek out how to do that. How can we creatively find ways to maybe create another kind of public diplomacy corps, or use what we have in the Peace Corps or something to allow American citizens to continue to engage with people and to break those barriers down, and so that we continue to know each other, and people can't start filling in the blanks with something that's a lie. So
That sounds like a nice segue for Gary to maybe comment.
Eric is absolutely correct in that many of our missions overseas are embassies, which originally were intended showcases of the United States. We used classic American architecture, transparent, easy to get into because we're an easy, accessible nation and society, have now been turned into fortresses. I don't know how many of you tried to get into an American embassy. It ain't easy. And in the old days, it was pretty easy to come. You go through the Marine Guard and you're in. You meet with people. We go out. When I was in my first assignment in Nicaragua, I went to the war zone 2-3 times a week. And then I came home to my family. My wife didn't like it. But I'd go, there was a battle last night. Next day, I'd get my driver and we'd troop out there. I'd talk to wounded soldiers in hospitals. I'd go to the towns where the battles were fought. I wanted to know what had happened because I know what the media is reporting, but I don't know if that's correct or not. There was no way a Foreign Service officer would ever be able to do that today. I had a fair amount of mobility when I was in Baghdad because of my rank. They were willing to put 25 people on me to take care of me. Of course, that means I got a cordon around me. I can go see whom I need to see, but I can't stop on the way back at the local cafe and sit down and have a cup of coffee and maybe talk with a couple of the folks there, just whatever. I can't do that in Baghdad. I never got to do that, which was extraordinarily frustrating. So we do have a problem. Like our soldiers, although not the equivalent, our diplomats take risks. And every diplomat I've ever met understands that. There are risks associated with the job you do. And if you're not cut out for that, not everyone is, then there are lots of other professions you can pursue. And I don't know how many times I was obliged to tell my staff, no, you can't go there today. Because the security people say they're doing something else, someone else is going somewhere. Now, if Ambassador Grappo wants to go, yeah, we'll make it happen. Although there were a couple of times I was told I can't go. So we do have to take a different view about how we want our diplomats to engage. We are pretty social people, Americans. We like getting out and talking to people. It's kind of who we are. We don't only talk about some things. We can talk about everything, but not behind walls, not behind 4-inch thick glass. It's very, very difficult. Secondly, as Eric mentioned, I don't need to tell anyone in our country how politically polarized we are. And very few of our senior leadership are willing to risk the loss of a diplomat. Just doesn't sound right. I mean, we'll take the loss of a soldier, but soldiers are trained to take risks. They go into combat. But somehow the perception exists that diplomats don't. But of course we are, and they don't want to take the risk of suffering the political heat, and Secretary Clinton did. I don't know any one of my Foreign Service colleagues who blamed Secretary Clinton. Not a single, well, there may be one or two, but none that I know blamed her. And in the end, as much as I liked Chris Stevens, as much respect I had for him, and as dedicated a diplomat as he was, in the end, the ultimate decision to go or not go to Benghazi was his, which is as it should be. And tragically, it just didn't go the way Chris expected. And if you talk to his mother and father, they will tell you the same thing. So our political leadership has to understand there are risks associated with diplomacy. Maybe not with the Canadians, but I can guarantee you there are with Iraqis and Syrians and a lot of other folks in the Middle East. But that's where real diplomacy takes place. Hey, everybody gets along with Canada, and they even play baseball and hockey. They invented hockey, I guess. So it's going to require transformation in terms of how our leadership thinks, and also a transformation in terms of how we see the conduct of diplomacy at the grassroots level.
Well, there are costs to this kind of work, and I'd just like to say that we have an opportunity for more conversation because we have coffee and cookies this time. Let me say a couple of thank yous. First of all, logistically, you have a feedback form. We take your comments seriously. We will be back with another program with Mark Jenkins focusing on Tibet and China on March 1st. But please take a moment and put your feedback forms out on the table out there. Please, budget cuts in Wyoming, please give us the pencil back. There's a reason they're half pencils, because you don't really want a half pencil. The other thing is that one of the ways we stay in communication is to, actually we do a lot of our publicity through email. So if you're willing to put your name and your email down, it's simply a list so that you know what's coming up in this area. So please do that. Well, do it if you're so inclined. And I would say thank you once again to the U.S. Senator Malcolm Wallop Fund for Conversations and Democracy, which helped us, the University of Wyoming, bring this to you today. Thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences and the American Heritage Center. But most of all, I want to thank Ambassador Grappo, Eric Nye, David Demick, and Chris Hare for sharing their knowledge today.